The creative process is an integral part of my life course. In the beginning, it occupied many of my childhood spaces, the playground, games, and some painting competition. But it is as an adult that I become aware of the therapeutic and central role that creating plays in my artistic life, and especially during difficult times. A significant moment was when I was arrested in Haiti. I am of Haitian origin, and I was caught up in a sordid incident of arbitrary arrest, and I found myself trapped in the machine at the time of torture, beating, etc. Without going into all the detail of this journey, I spent about a month in prison, but I remember that during my incarceration, painting, drawing, and writing occupied an important part of my time. Part of the time, I drew these women who had been victims of social injustice, subject to arbitrary arrests, these women who were defenseless. On the other hand, I realized for the first time the very tangible social inequalities of the system. On the other hand, I used painting and drawing as a refuge to rebuild myself internally after having experienced humiliation, fear, and threat. The impression of a nearby death, perhaps a prelude of a death foretold. I did not know what the future held, and so I drew these women relentlessly while listening to their stories. Getting to know these women, I realized just how important the gap was between the mode of existence of a certain part of Haitian society and these women who struggled on a daily basis. But what struck me most was their reality, that I would not qualify as medieval, but somehow I felt that they were living in another century. Women who were arrested because they were accused of eating children, women who were selling tomatoes in the street and told me about the stoning of a person. At the time, the Père Lebrun, a torture which consisted of putting a tire around the neck of a person and burning him because he or she was a former Tonton Macoute and had committed all kinds of abuses in the neighborhoods. So as I listened to these stories, I took notes and I drew. Incarceration was not all about horrors. Of course there were horrible moments where we didn't have access to basic needs, no latrines, no water, and so on. But there were also moments of solidarity among women. Solidarity through singing, solidarity shared during prayers. Since I'm a person of faith, praying helped me cope during these hard times. Solidarity in our laughter, or while sharing our emotions, or sharing love stories that developed in prison. Even though they were only women's cells, somehow these women managed to have messengers. I forgot their names at the time, but through these sorts of messengers, like a courier service, and though the men's quarters and the women's quarter were located in two different buildings, the women managed to send love notes. Being in an environment where most women were illiterate, I became a scribe, some sort of a public writer. So I wrote love letters to perfect strangers, to men I didn't know. I arrived in Montreal, I would say around 1991, early spring of 1991, a time period in which I had to quickly reconstruct myself at all levels. Thankfully, I was lucky to benefit from the Haitian Diaspora's network, a welcoming network with relatives living here. My brother and sister-in-law were established here, and I had my cousin. I was well greeted, and I had no financial or material worries. However, the great challenge was to rebuild myself emotionally and not have to return to Haiti, where I feared reprisal. I had already experienced reprisal for a very short time period after I was released. The regime of the time used the old methods of all dictatorships to frighten the person who was released, for example, by following them by car, by sending messages through intermediaries. So on one hand, I had this anguish to obtain some kind of legal status, since I had applied for refugee status in order to settle to Montreal. And on the other hand, I also had the need to rebuild myself emotionally and physically because I had become very thin, I had lost so much weight, etc. Overall, I was facing the great challenge of reconstructing oneself.
Le grand défi de la reconstruction. Je me rappelle pas très bien de l'entrevue au niveau de l'obtention de...
I don't remember in details the interview to obtain refugee status. I remember I was accompanied by a lawyer who was from the office of Julius Gray, and I also remember collecting all the information. I had meticulously undertaken the task and I wanted to present a solid case. So I made tremendous effort to describe in detail the events surrounding my arrest by including key moments such as the torture, the beating, and all the rest. For sure, this stirred up many emotions, but having experienced some tough moments, I told my story and tried my best to suppress my tears. I was so involved in retelling my own story that at one point I glanced in the direction of the woman lawyer who accompanied me, and I was struck when I realized that she was in tears.
Et qui était en larmes. Et la seule question que j'ai eu à poser à l'époque, c'est que est-ce que mon histoire est convaincante?
Curiously, the only question I had to ask her after the interview was, is my story convincing? At the time, I was so scared that people would not believe me that I sincerely emptied all my guts. For a short moment, for a split second, I saw her look filled with empathy and distress.
Un quart de seconde d'empathie et de détresse. Au niveau matériel, j'habitais chez une de mes tantes qui habitait Boucherville, Ghislaine, qui est en fait...
In terms of material support, I was staying with my aunt, Ghislaine, who at the time lived in Boucherville. She's an ultimate treasure of hospitality. She played a major role in my integration, and she remains a key person in terms of her ability to love and her genuine generosity. So during these few months, my time was divided between looking for a job and painting. Painting played a major part. So on the one hand, having applied for refugee status, I had to rapidly collect information and evidence to prove my story. This task plunged me back emotionally, and I was busy going to the library, collecting press clipping, and meeting with the lawyer. On the other hand, I was going to the art studio. My brother, my sister-in-law, my cousins and friends from the Haitian community had given me some acrylics, pastel, and art supply, and so I started tirelessly painting these women. Women now that I can look back and analyze the work more serenely, women with a haggard look, a look of sadness, women drifting with a feeling of loneliness. I would say somewhat, women who lost their bearings. However, the Creole identity was strongly present in these pieces. Perhaps at the time I needed to relate to something fundamental, my Haitian and my Creole identity as a woman. Who knows what happens in the conscious and unconscious while creating? It's a mystery that's beyond me.
En tant que femme, créole, je sais pas, peut-être au niveau conscient et inconscient, il se passe des choses dans la création qui nous dépassent. Tu vas évoquer les enfants. De cette période, ce que je retiens, au-delà de...
During this time period, besides the challenge of having to get a job and earn a living and finding housing, luckily I had the opportunity to benefit from my support network. Nevertheless, the main difficulty resided in the fact that I did not want to lose this spring of energy inside of me. My personal challenge was to maintain a certain level of optimism, cheerfulness, joy of life, spirituality, and I think I'm reaching that goal slowly every day. Well, come to think of it, it's not an objective in itself, but a way of looking at life. Therefore, the challenge was not to sink in what I would call darkness or internal obscurantism.
Pas sombrer dans ce que j'appelle une sorte d'obscurantisme intérieur.
As an artist, creating is above all a true passion, a passion that occupies every aspect of my life. Creating is a need, selfish as it is, necessary for the fun of it, and an essential need because it is inherently part of me. By creating, I express myself. That's how I visualize ideas in words, in images, in colors. I exist through painting and define my personality through creating. I would say that my painting is primarily of African inspiration. African in its graphic approach with geometrical figures. Sometimes, as a tribute and a wink to Picasso, I use bike seats to create a bull. However, the inspiration is African because it is part of me. Do I have to justify my inspiration? I would think not. I'm drawn to it, it is part of me, and aesthetically, this is where I'm at. In effect, when I say I do not know why Africa is part of me, it's not totally true. I know very well where the African inspiration comes from. Partly because I'm Haitian, and so there's all the historical background. I know my roots, but also because I grew up in North Africa. I grew up in Casablanca, Morocco, and in Algeria. My parents from 1965 to 96 moved to Algeria, and then moved in 1966 to 1980s to Casablanca, Morocco, where I spent all of my childhood and adolescence.
En résumé, je pourrais dire que créer pour moi...
In summary, creating helped me recreate myself. Creating to exist, creating to be.